The ink on the Constitution was barely dry. The United States was less a nation and more a fragile, vibrating idea, held together by handshake deals and the desperate, terrifying hope that this whole experiment wouldn't collapse within a decade. We like to imagine the Founding Fathers standing in marble halls, debating philosophy with calm, stoic expressions. We imagine a start that was dignified, orderly. But on a freezing morning in New York City, while the rest of the world watched to see if democracy would survive, the people living inside it were busy doing something else. They were gambling. They were betting on a future that didn't exist yet. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the founders of the American financial system weren't thinking about liberty or justice or the long arc of history. They were watching a line on a ledger go up and up and up. They trusted a man who told them that wealth was infinite. They trusted a system that had absolutely no rules. And by the time they realized the money wasn't real, the mob was already gathering outside the prison walls, carrying torches and looking for blood. We are taught that the Great Depression was the first time America's heart stopped. We are wrong. The first heart attack happened when the country was just an infant. And it didn't just threaten your bank account. It threatened to erase the United States from the map. To understand how close we came to the edge, you have to forget the New York City, you know. Erase the steel. Erase the subway rumble. Erase the grid. Go back to 1792. New York was a muddy, chaotic port town perched on the tip of a wild island. It smelled of sea salt, curing tobacco, horse manure, and fresh timber. It was small enough that everyone knew your face, but crowded enough that you could lose your soul in the alleyways. The Revolutionary War was over, but the war for survival was just starting. The air in lower Manhattan felt heavy, not with humidity, but with expectation. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, had just pulled off a bureaucratic miracle. He had taken the worthless, crumpled debt of the old war, promises that soldiers had sold for pennies to buy bread, and turned them into legitimate government bonds. Suddenly, pieces of paper that people had used to light fireplaces were worth gold. It was alchemy. And because of this alchemy, money was everywhere. Credit was flowing through the cobblestone streets like wine at a wedding. But the real drug wasn't gold. It was scrip. Scrip was paper representing shares in the brand new Bank of the United States. It was the hottest commodity on the face of the earth. If you walked down Wall Street in early 1792, you wouldn't hear the orderly ticking of a regulated market. You would hear shouting. You would hear the wet slap of hands shaking on deals that involved more money than most men saw in a lifetime. There were no exchanges, no tickers, no SEC, no Federal Reserve. No safety net, just raw, unfiltered human greed taking place in the open air. Auctions happened on street corners. Deals were cut in the back of the Tontine Coffee House, where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of roasted beans. It felt electric. It felt like the dawn of a golden empire. Merchants were abandoning their shops to trade paper. Doctors were ignoring patients to check prices. But underneath the excitement, the foundation was soft. The entire economy was running on trust. Trust that the government would pay. Trust that the banks were solvent. Trust that the man selling you a slip of paper actually owned it. Nothing felt broken. The ships were sailing out of the harbor. The coffee was pouring. The prices were rising every single hour. It felt like the party would never end. In the middle of this euphoria stood a man named William Duer. History has largely forgotten him, which is strange, because he almost destroyed the country single-handedly. If you saw him in 1792, you'd trust him. You'd want to be him. He was charming. He was impossibly wealthy. He was well-connected. He had served as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Hamilton. He was the definition of an insider. He knew how the machine worked because he had helped build the gears. Duer looked at this new financial system, this delicate experimental machine Hamilton had built to save the country, and he didn't see a tool for stability. He saw a loophole. He saw a way to become the richest man in the Western Hemisphere. The decision he made didn't look dangerous at first. It looked practical. It looked like business. Duer decided he wanted to corner the market on U.S. debt securities. He wanted to own so much of the bank stock that he could dictate the price, squeeze the short sellers, and walk away with a king's ransom. But he had a problem. He was rich, but he wasn't that rich. To corner a market, you need liquidity. You need an ocean of cash. So he did something that seems incredibly modern and incredibly reckless. He started borrowing. He borrowed from banks. He borrowed from wealthy merchants, but that wasn't enough. The appetite of his scheme was too big. So he turned to the streets. He opened his doors to the public. He promised outrageous interest rates to anyone who would lend him cash. He offered 3, 4, 5% a month. Shopkeepers, widows, farmers, butchers, they all looked at the numbers. They looked at William Duer, the hero of the Revolution, the friend of Hamilton, the smartest man in the room. And they handed him their life savings. They gave him gold. They gave him silver. They gave him titles to their land. It was a small decision for each of them. Just a loan, just a leverage play. Duer took this mountain of cash and formed a secret partnership, a combine, to manipulate the prices. He bet everything on the market going up. He bought on time, on what we would today call futures contracts. He was buying stock he couldn't afford, betting that the price would rise before the bill came due. It felt like a sure thing. And for a few months, it was. The price of bank scrip went from $25 to over $300 in a matter of weeks. Duer was a god. He was making everyone rich. He walked the streets of New York like a king, and the city bowed to him. The fever spread through New York like a virus. In the coffee houses of Wall Street, men stopped talking about politics. They stopped talking about the weather or the harvest. They only talked about the 6%, the government bonds. People who had never held a bond in their lives were suddenly quitting their legitimate trades to become speculators. It was a mania, a collective hallucination. A carriage driver could make a year's wages in an afternoon just by buying a piece of paper in the morning and selling it at lunch. Why work? Why build? Why plant crops? The paper made money by itself. But then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a loud crack. It was a subtle change in the wind, a drop in temperature. The Bank of the United States, the very institution whose stock was being traded, realized things were getting too hot. They saw the bubble expanding, thinning, ready to burst. So they tapped the brakes. The bank tightened credit. They stopped handing out money so freely. They called in loans. Money became scarce. Suddenly, the ocean of cash that Duer was swimming in began to evaporate. The interest payments Duer had promised to the widows and the butchers were due. But he didn't have the cash. He had stocks. And to pay the interest, he needed to sell the stocks. But everyone else needed to sell too. First came the whispers in the Tontine coffee house. Duer is late on a payment. I heard he asked for an extension. The bank isn't lending today. Then came the lines. People gathered outside Duer's mansion near Broadway. Not to invest, but to collect. The faces in the street changed. The excitement was gone, replaced by a confused anxiety. A tightness in the chest. They looked at each other, waiting for someone to say it was okay. Waiting for Duer to come out on his balcony, smile that charming smile, and hand them their gold. But the door stayed closed. The curtains stayed drawn. The silence on Wall Street became deafening. The shouting auctions stopped. The heavy realization settled over the city like a fog. The money wasn't there. It had never really been there. It was just a promise, and the promise was broken. It's easy to look back at 1792 and laugh at their naivety. We think we're smarter now. We think we have algorithms and safeguards. But stories like this are easy to forget, because they are uncomfortable. They remind us that the systems we trust, the banks, the markets, the value of the dollar itself, are often just people in a room making guesses. That's why digging up these hidden chapters matters. It stops us from sleepwalking into the next one. If you're enjoying this dive into the dark side of history and you want to uncover more forgotten disasters, you know what to do. But back on the streets of New York, the time for lessons was over. March 9th, 1792. That was the day the bottom fell out. William Duer ran out of liquidity. He stopped paying his debts. The news hit New York with the force of a cannonball. The king of the speculators was broke. The logic of the crash was brutal and simple. If Duer was broke, the people who lent him money were broke. And if they were broke, they couldn't pay their debts to the grocer, or the landlord, or the supplier. It was a chain reaction, a domino effect of insolvency that raced through the city faster than a fire. Asset prices collapsed instantly. Bank stocks that were worth hundreds of dollars days ago were suddenly worthless paper. No one was buying, everyone was selling. But there were no buyers. The credit markets froze completely. In a modern economy, we call this a liquidity crisis. In 1792, they just called it ruin. Merchants closed their shops. Ships sat in the harbor, unable to offload cargo because no one had cash to pay for it. The paralysis was total, but the panic wasn't just financial, it was physical. The mob outside Duer's house grew violent. They didn't want explanations, they wanted blood. These weren't faceless investors. These were the neighbors he had swindled. The gardener who had given him his savings. The shopkeeper who had mortgaged his store. They threatened to tear him limb from limb. Stones were thrown, torches were lit. Duer, the man who had dined with presidents, had to make a humiliating choice. To avoid being murdered in the street by the very people who had worshipped him weeks earlier, he surrendered. He was thrown into the new jail, the debtor's prison. It was a cold, damp, miserable facility, and ironically, it was the only safe place left for him. But locking him up didn't solve the problem. The money was gone. The entire economy of the United States, this brand new, fragile experiment, ground to a halt. By then, it didn't matter who caused it. The system was already breaking. And in Philadelphia, the government watched in horror. They realized that if the New York economy collapsed, the United States might die in its crib. Thomas Jefferson looked at the chaos and saw proof that his agrarian vision was right, that cities and banks were engines of evil. But Alexander Hamilton saw something else. He saw the end of the American dream before it had even begun. Alexander Hamilton was sitting at his desk, watching his life's work burn. He had built the financial system to give America legitimacy. He wanted the U.S. to be taken seriously by powers like Britain and France. Now, his system was the laughingstock of the world. Critics were already circling. They whispered that this was proof. Banks were scams. Capitalism was a sin, and Hamilton was a fool who had led the sheep to the slaughter. He had to act, but he had no playbook. There was no precedent. No government had ever intervened in a market crash like this before. The very concept of a bailout didn't exist. The safe option, the political option, was to let it burn out. Let the speculators fail, let the market find its own bottom. Let the gamblers learn their lesson. But Hamilton knew the bottom was an abyss. If he did nothing, the legitimate businesses would fail alongside the gamblers. The innocent would starve with the guilty. The credit of the United States would be destroyed, and the country would be unable to borrow money to defend itself or build infrastructure. So he did something radical. He didn't choose the best option. He chose the last one. Hamilton wrote a series of urgent letters to William Seton, the cashier of the Bank of New York. In these letters, he authorized the bank to buy government bonds. He was effectively printing money to prop up the market. He told the bankers to buy the debt at face value, even though the market price was lower. He was acting as a lender of last resort. He poured cash into the frozen engine of the economy. He bought the bonds that no one else wanted. He flooded the streets with liquidity to stop the panic. He gave Seton specific instructions. Buy loudly. Go into the market, the strategy implied. Make sure everyone sees you buying. He wasn't just fixing the math. He was trying to fix the fear. He needed the people to see that the government still believed in the paper. Slowly, agonizingly, the bleeding stopped. Because the government was buying, the prices stabilized. The fear that everything is worth zero faded. Men returned to the coffeehouses, pale and shaken, but solvent. The lines outside the banks disappeared. The ships in the harbor began to unload their cargo again. The Panic of 1792 didn't kill the patient, but it changed him forever. William Duer never got out. He died in debtor's prison 7 years later. The man who almost bought the United States died inside a cage, penniless, sick, and forgotten. Even inside the prison, he tried to keep trading. He tried to run schemes from his cell until the very end, addicted to the game that destroyed him. But the real change happened on the street. The brokers and merchants who survived looked around at the wreckage. They looked at the mud, the angry mobs, the chaos of the open street. They realized that the chaos of the unvetted auctions, where any scoundrel could sell a lie, was too dangerous. They needed rules. They needed a wall to keep the chaos out. They needed to know exactly who they were trading with. So, a few weeks later, on May 17th, 1792, 24 of the most prominent brokers met outside 68 Wall Street. They stood under a massive buttonwood tree, a sycamore that provided shade on the bustling street. They drafted a short agreement. It wasn't a law. It wasn't a treatise. It was just 2 sentences. They agreed to trade only with each other. They agreed to set fixed commissions. They agreed to honor their word. It was known as the Buttonwood Agreement. That group of men, standing under a tree in the shadow of a financial apocalypse, created an exclusive club. That club would eventually move indoors. It would grow. It would adopt technology. It would become the New York Stock Exchange. The most powerful financial engine in human history was born not out of optimism, not out of glory, but out of trauma. It was a defense mechanism, a way to ensure that a man like William Duer could never threaten the system again. The money Americans use today still carries traces of this decision. The Federal Reserve? That's Hamilton's intervention formalized. The bailouts of 2008? That's the Panic of 1792, repeated on a global scale. The idea that the government should step in when the market fails? It all started here. Hamilton's desperate gamble became the standard operating procedure for the modern world. We live in the house that Panic built. We tend to look at stock tickers and marble bank buildings as symbols of stability. We think the economy is a science, governed by laws as rigid as gravity. We look at the charts and we see math. But the Panic of 1792 teaches us the unsettling truth. The economy isn't math, it's psychology. It's human beings in a room feeling greedy or feeling scared. The line between a golden age and a total collapse is incredibly thin. It relies on the fragile belief that tomorrow will be better than today. When that belief breaks, no amount of marble, no amount of regulation, and no amount of history can stop the panic. The most dangerous financial moments don't arrive loudly, with armies and cannons. They arrive quietly. They arrive with a smile, a handshake, and a promise that this time, the rules don't apply. They arrive when we are most confident. They ask to be trusted, and usually we say yes. If you want to understand America's future, you have to keep watching its past. There are more hidden chapters like this, moments where the timeline almost snapped and nobody remembers them. I want to tell you about the plot to steal Lincoln's body, or the time the U.S. government poisoned alcohol during Prohibition. If you want to see those stories, make sure you're subscribed. I'll see you in the next Shadow of History.